studies. He received his doctorate from the University of Munich, the LMU, with a PhD thesis on James Joyce and manipulated satire. And we were really sad to have the James Joyce panel somehow getting kind of lost in the conference. So perhaps if you have a Joyce question, you could log it. His second book then was on early modern literature, and it is Leaving Revenge Tragedy, and that appeared in 2022. And that's not here on the bio note, but he is also a Shakespeare scholar, and we know each other, and several of us actually know Dieter also from the German Shakespeare Society. He has been very active as a board member there, and been a real benefit for that association as well. In Vienna, he is director of the Vienna Center for Irish Studies, which was founded by Werner Huber, and he's also the head of Vienna Irish Studies and Culture Theory, the summer school there. He also works as a regular visiting professor at the University of Ljubljana, teaches blog seminars there, and he is part of the advisory board of Acta Neophilologica. And today he's talking to us also on a very modern topic, which I'm really happy to have in here, the Animalized Irish and the early modern discourse of the Wetnurse.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction. All right, so my paper elucidates how the Irish were misrepresented as savages or half-human in times of the Tudor conquest during the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. As I will show, this process of animalization manifests itself in the early modern discourse of the Irish wet nurse, entrusted with the care of English-born babies. And yeah, if we look at some pictorial representations of early modern wet nurses. So most of you will be familiar with this painting that is exhibited at the Louvre Museum. It shows Gabrielle d'Este, the mistress of the French King Henri IV, and it dates around 1600. And yeah, as you can see, there exist various versions of that painting. And in this version, we have a wet nurse in the background, and here is another wet nurse in the background. And even in the most famous version, what we can see in the background, it's not a wet nurse, but as I read up, it's a domestic servant, apparently sewing baby clothes. So the connection to childbirth, fertility, etc., it's there. And I would argue that the wet nurse, absently present in the background, she's sort of functioning like the negative, positive print of a photo. So you can see the ladies, the upper class ladies, with the Petrarchan spotless white skin. The wet nurse, she has to work. She has come in contact with the sun, hence she has a suntan. And as far as the representational code is concerned, I would say that, on the one hand, we have the representation of the wet nurse. So we have the physicality of the lower class body. So this is quite straightforward. The wet nurse is shown what she's doing by profession. So the body is featured in terms of the material functions. And on the other hand, we have the upper class ladies. There's luxury, leisure, and if we look at the breasts, we could say that in terms of Charles Sanders Peirce, these are symbolic signs. So signs where the relationship between the signifier and the signified is regulated by a cultural code, and we need this cultural code in order to interpret these highly artificial signs of courtly lifestyle, whereas the wet nurse in terms of Peirce would be referred to as an iconic sign. So what you see is what you get. There's a visual resemblance between the signifier and the signified. And this is also the reason why this culturally encoded gesture of sister touching the nipples it has been reinterpreted over and over and over again by art historians. And as we don't know this symbolically charged cultural code, we can't really say what the artist had in mind in terms of cultural representation and signification. And yeah, now I'm referring to literature, and my first sample would be Edmund Spenser's pamphlet, A View of the Present State of Ireland. And in this pamphlet, Edmund Spenser states that whereas the uncivilized Gaelic idiom of the Wetnurse corrupts the English-born baby's mental capacities, the milk produced by the Irish Wetnurses nourishes the unruly bodily passions of the foster infants. As would be shown, both Irish milk and the Gaelic idiom trigger fears of what I would call effeminization or emasculation. In this context, three aspects of humanist phallogocentric discourse have to be taken into account. First, the early modern one-sex model, which claims that the fully fledged masculine man created in the biblical father deity's image represents the norm of being human in humanist discourse, whereas the masculine man in control of a civilized language imbued with the Greco-Roman heritage strengthens an infant's masculinity and intellect in terms of food for thought. Irish indigenous women are featured as inarticulate breeders and feeders who are supposed to have an feminizing, if not to say dehumanizing effect on the children they are entrusted with. Hence, the native Gaelic linguistic tradition is othered as a barbarian idiom to be eradicated rather than seen as a civilized language. Referring to the circumstance that colonizers consider the native tongue of the subjects as a barbarian idiom rather than proper language, Spenser writes, "For it had ever been the use of the conqueror to despise the language of the conquered and to force him by all means to learn his. So did the Romans always use, in so much that there is almost no nation in the world but is sprinkled with their language." This ties in with the second aspect of humanist phallogocentric discourse to be looked at, the ability to speak a civilized language comparable to the Yavitic father deity's tongue speaking the world into being, which distinguishes humans from non-human creatures. Third aspect is the claim that the concept of masculinity attributed to the human intellect and the divine power of the word or logos is constantly challenged by the effeminate principle of the body's unruly passions, or as Spenser puts it, I suppose that the chief cause of bringing in the Irish language amongst them was especially their fostering and marrying with the Irish, the which are two most dangerous infections. For first, the child that sucketh the milk of the nurse must by necessity learn his first speech of her, the which being the first that is inured to his tongue is evermore after. Not only of the speech, but also of the manners and conditions. And note the fact that the baby is automatically referred to as a masculine baby, and not a girl. So proper infant is a masculine infant. Considering intermarriage or going native with the Irish a threat to the human disposition, Spenser animalizes the English babies entrusted to Irish Wetnurses as ape-like beings whose humanity is challenged, if not to say corrupted, by the milk produced by the Wetnurse as non-human indigenous food. So I wrote this presentation on a Mac and I converted it to PDF, and we can see it on the Microsoft machine. So for first, For besides that young children be like apes, which will affect and imitate what they see done before them, especially by their nurses whom they love so well, they moreover draw into themselves together with the suck, even the nature and disposition of their nurses, for the mind followeth much the temperature of the body, and also the words are the images of the mind. So as they proceeding from the mind must be needs affected with the words, so that the speech being Irish, the heart must needs be Irish, for out of the abundance of the heart the tongue speaketh. The next is the marrying with the Irish, which how dangerous thing it is in all commonwealths appeareth to every simplest sense. Like linguistic first-hand contact with the Gaelic language, the milk produced by the indigenous Wetnurse is misrepresented as a harmful bodily liquid, which nourishes the English-born infant's flesh, but corrupts their intellectual capacities. Spencer's anxiety that the English children's human disposition is challenged by the Irish wet nurses as animal-like breeders and feeders is not only echoed in Swift's 18th century modest proposal, which misrepresents the Irish mothers as animal-like dams or breeders. It is first of all foreshadowed in an English sonnet written 1 year after the beginning of the Tudor conquest. The Earl of Surrey's From Tuscan Came, My Lady's Worthy Race, which praises the Tuscan-born young English lady Geraldine, raised by an Irish wet nurse. And although you're all familiar with that poem, I'll read it out again. From Tuscan came my lady's worthy race. Fair Florence was sometime her ancient seat. The Western Isle, whose pleasant shoulders face wild Cambus cliffs that give her lively heat. Fostered she was with milk of Irish breast. Her sir and earl, her dame of princess blood. From tender years in Britain she doth rest, with king's child, where she tasted costly food. Hansen did first present her to mine eye, bright as her and Geraldine she hight. Hampton me taught to wish her first of mine, and Windsor, alas, doth chase me from her side. Her beauty of kind, her virtues from above. Happy is he that may obtain her love. Although the cultural topography of England and Tuscany are mentioned in great detail, Ireland is only vaguely referred to as the Western Isle rather than by its proper name, being referred to as an unnamed island facing Wales known as Cumbria, the Western Isle, whose pleasant shoulders face wild Cambus cliffs. Ireland, as an unnamed territory, escapes cultural representation. Not only Tuscany and Florence as the cradle of Italian Renaissance high culture are explicitly mentioned in the poem, but also English Renaissance culture imported from Italy to the court of Henry VIII, residing in Hunstanton Estate, Windsor Castle, and Hampton Courts. As a cultural transfer process from Florence to southern England, the poem reflects the fact that Henry's courtly makers, Wyatt and Surrey, imported Italian Renaissance high culture and the poetic genre of the Petrarchan sonnet, and this is reflected on a meta level. When Geraldine's pedigree is mentioned as her sir and earl, a dame of princess blood, the lyrical eye poses the Petrarchan lover of the young damsel, who is the daughter of Gerald Fitzgerald, the 9th Earl of Kildare, whose 1534 disposition as Irish Lord Deputy or Vice King initialized the rebellions to be followed by the Tudor conquest, featured in both Surrey's sonnet and Spencer's pro-English propaganda, a view of the present state of Ireland. So the lady addressed is the historical Geraldine, alias Elizabeth Fitzgerald. She was born in Ireland in 1528 and moved to the English court of Henry in 1533, the year before her father fell from royal grace, was imprisoned in the Tower, and died. As far as Geraldine's Florentine ancestors are concerned, there's a scholarly debate whether Elizabeth Fitzgerald belongs to the same family as the enigmatic woman depicted on Leonardo da Vinci's famous Gioconda portrait, the Tuscan, Florence-based Gherardini clan as her family. Hence, there's some reason to assume that Geraldine's original family is named Gherardini, and this name was anglicized into Fitzgerald when a branch of the Florentine Gherardini clan became the Earls of Kildare, Irish viceroys, and lost their deputyship under Henry's hasty and violent temper. In Italy, the Gherardini clan not only owned an urban palace in Florence mentioned in the sonnet, they also possessed a country estate in the Chianti Hills, an estate which is nowadays a winery. Nowadays, this place is called Vigna Maggio Castello di Mona Lisa. And some people claim that the landscape in the background of Leonardo's painting corresponds with the panoramic view from the terrace of this estate in Tuscany. Although there has been a long tradition of speculation about Mona Lisa's identity, which may be traced back to a 1550 comment by the Renaissance art historian Giorgio Vasari, an archival proof of the Gherardini connection has quite recently been discovered by Veit Probst, a librarian from Heidelberg University. But it is not only Da Vinci's Mona Lisa who transforms the Gherardini estate into a piece of popular culture. In 1993, this mansion became the location of Kenneth Branagh's film based on Shakespeare's Monsieur Do About Nothing. Whereas the Gherardini family migration from Italy to England via Ireland may be considered a transfer of Italian Renaissance culture to the Tudor court of Henry VIII, English Renaissance culture returns back to its Italian place of origin when the Irish-born Kenneth Branagh stages Shakespeare at the Tuscan Gherardini estate in the contemporary period. And as in the case of the Irish Geraldine, the Hibernian dimension of this circulation of culture and energy escapes cultural representation and remains unacknowledged. Born on an island misrepresented as a place of nature rather than culture, the non-description of Geraldine's unnamed and silenced wet nurse is reduced to the bodily, if not to say animal function of the lactating breasts she presents to the English girl as a feeder. Fostered she was with milk of Irish breast. That's all we get to know about the anonymous wet nurse who escapes cultural representation. And this aspect, again, may be connected with a statement from Spencer's view of the present state of Ireland. Especially by their nurses, whom they love so well, they moreover draw into themselves together with their suck, even the nature and disposition of their nurses, for the mind followeth much the temperature of the body, and also the words are the images of the mind. Inspiring the girl's body with animal-like lively heat associated with the female body, allegedly ruled by unruly passions, Ireland and the unnamed Irish wet nurse as a past pro toto infused the girl with effeminate heat to be contained and controlled when Geraldine enters the civilized masculine sphere of the English court as an education process to become an accomplished young lady. Although hardly mentioned at all, Ireland as an effeminate territory of nature rather than culture, a virgin territory to be planted and plowed by its colonizer, is misrepresented as an anarchic sphere of rebellion, unrest, and political upheaval. As a medium of court politics, the sonnet presents Geraldine's Irish childhood as a transitory space embedded in her family's long-time movement from Florence to London as places of early modern high culture, hence the already noted references to Henry's court, contrasting with Ireland as Geraldine's interim home as an unmentioned and unnamed counterworld, such as the anarchic green worlds of Shakespeare's comedies, associated with misrule and the Bachtilian carnivalesque. Thus, the English court is presented as a nurturing sphere where the offspring of Florentine aristocrats is given back her ladylike disposition she has lost during her childhood in the Hibernian wilderness, an anarchic experience of going native, which has transformed her into a shrewish country wench. Once the courtly taming of the Irish shrew is accomplished, the Anglo-Hibernian half-breed Geraldine will be prepared to be married by an English aristocrat whose patriarchal guidance will transform her into a thoroughly English lady and make her forget her uncivilized past as the daughter of the rebellious and anarchic Hibernian warlord Gerald Fitzgerald of Kildare. Last but not least, I would like to concentrate on the final lines of the poem. From tender years in Britain she doth rest, with the king's child, where she tasted costly food. As there has been a long editorial debate whether the food to be consumed at Henry's court is referred to as costly or ghostly, one might claim that the sonnet misrepresents Ireland as a natural place offering food for the English-born Geraldine's body, whereas Henrician England is fashioned as a cultural place offering food for thought and spiritual nourishment, an aspect which again ties in with English humanism as a language-centered movement, a movement which not only claims that it is the ability to speak which distinguishes humans from inarticulate animals, considering that it is the Yahwitic father deity who speaks the world into being before he creates the first man, Adam, in his likeness. God is presented as doing things with words by way of performative speech analyzed by Austen's 1962 landmark study. So here you have some samples of the divine words speaking the world into being as an Austinian speech act. Defining the human via the gift of language, humanist phallocentric discourse is not only imbued with the biblical book of Genesis as the account of God's creational miracle performed as a speech act. It is, first of all, informed by the philological miracle of Pentecost, which celebrates God's universal gift of tongues, or logos, to humankind, sending the Holy Ghost to Christ's apostles in the shape of fiery tongues. The resurrected Jesus enables his disciples to speak and understand all languages of the world via what may be considered a truly humanist lingua franca. As an ancient Greek term, glossa means both tongue and language. Hence, the humanists define the human being as an animal, loquens, or significance, as a speaking or meaning-making animal. This language-centered approach to being human is celebrated in Souris Geraldine's sonnet. As Geraldine is restored to her humanity by way of divine or Eucharist-like ghostly food, the dehumanizing influence of her unnamed and inarticulate Irish wet nurse has to be compensated by the civilizing power of the English court as a polyglot counterworld, a sphere of humanist culture where the divine power of the word, which was in the beginning and spoke the world into being, is articulated in a civilized language, reflected in the poetic genre of the sonnets on a meta level. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking, not always, kind of but very thought-provoking paper. And we continue, as we said, with our second speaker, and then we'll have questions. It's a pleasure to introduce you to. Do we manage, or do we need help? Pleasure to introduce you to Teresa Dunne, a PhD candidate at the University of Galway at the Centre for Irish Studies there, and she's interested in issues of gender, national identity, and also the bilingual study of Irish literature. Very well, I think. The working title of her PhD thesis is Dead Men Walking: Masculinity, the Literary Representations of Threat in Post-Independence Ireland. And again, we have a gender theme, I think, connecting these two takes here as well. Her doctoral research is funded by the Irish Research Council, and it's supervised by Professor Louis Tower. And she's one of the co-organizers of the forthcoming conference in Galway of the Irish Studies Center, conference of the Irish Studies Center, on the theme of slow violence in Irish studies, and so also something that's I'm looking forward to your paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter, for a wonderful talk. It really kind of sets mine up, talking about the animality of the Irish language speaker, as my two authors that I'll have a look at, Flaherty and Pádraic, wrote in English. He was a native Irish language speaker and did have some work in the Irish language. So, comparison between humans and animals is often meant to degrade the subjectivity of the person or groups of people it describes, and it has a brutal and tragic history that we're so aware of, readily associated with racialized discrimination. The extent to which animalized characters of the Irish was a racist phenomenon is necessarily contentious. While L.P. Curtis famously argued in his book Apes and Angels, The Irishman in Victorian Caricature, that, quote, Irish inferiority was seen as a function of Irish ethnicity, end quote. He admits a correlation between militant activity in Ireland and the simianized portrayal of the Irish, and that, quote, the timing of this transmogrification into a guerrilla suggests that the coincidence of Fenianism with the debate over the origin of the species and the increase in social and political tensions arising out of the economic expansion of the mid-Victorian era lay at the root of this simianizing process, end quote. In Noel Eganatow's 1995 book, How the Irish Became White, he argues that Irish-American immigrants in the 19th century moved from a racial category of non-whiteness into a white supremacist framework by their oppressive treatment of Black Americans, despite the abolitionist Daniel O'Connell's call for solidarity between the immigrant Irish and Black Americans. Others, such as David Lloyd, have argued that this supposed racial restructuring could only have been possible if the Irish were already incorporated into an existing hierarchy of whiteness, as quote, since even emancipation failed to allow the former slaves to escape the taint of blackness and become fully fledged citizens, end quote. Moreover, as it is frequently debunked, Irish people, although oppressed historically in certain contexts, were never chattel slaves. This does not, and indeed did not, prevent people from employing the false analogy of slavery to the Irish situation, and the comparison gained currency during the late 19th century and was utilised by Irish nationalists. These often violent, animalised images of Irishness also encompassed a gendered element, as they represent the worst qualities often associated with hyper-masculinity. Indeed, Joseph Vellante argues that, as quote, masculinity came to be defined in terms of possession and regulated deployment of robust animal spirits, end quote, the double bind of Irish manhood was that their ability to control their unchecked masculine emotions made them irrational animals, while any acquiescence marks them as feminine. Regardless of the composition of this animalizing discourse, however, critical engagement with representations of animalized Irish men, often, to quote Maureen O'Connor here, in relation to Curtis's work, takes for granted the degradation implicit in the comparison between human and non-human animals, end quote. The implication that comparison with non-human animal is demeaning is often enough to silence any further engagement with human animality, especially with regard to tropes such as that of the simianized Irishman. Born just before the turn of the 20th century into a poor Irish-speaking family in the west of Ireland, as a young man, Liam O'Flaherty would join the British Army and participate in the Great War before returning to Ireland and briefly taking part in the Irish Civil War. Disillusioned by this war and suffering from shell shock after his experiences in the trenches, he would leave Ireland and travel extensively before turning to writing. O'Flaherty is regarded as having been a prolific, but quote, somewhat uneven writer of novels and short stories, end quote. His animal short stories are generally seen as the best of his work, and quote, if O'Flaherty is thought about all, it is more for his stories of animals and nature, end quote. These stories include Boss the Bow, an emotive portrayal of a cow's grief whose calf is stillborn, on Shark, the heart-wrenching tale of a hawk who dies trying to protect his family from humans, and on Fiach, which concerns the brutal killing of a rabbit from the point of view of both prey and his canine human predator team. While often lauded for these works, James Howard O'Brien suggests dismissively that the author's short stories, quote, fall back on peasants, animals, and children. The setting is that of farm, sea, or village, end quote. Implicit in this assessment is not just anthropocentrism, but classism and childism as well, as O'Brien links animals, poor smallholders and children as subjects not suitable for a literary examination. In critical studies of the author's work, it has been far more common, however, to take for granted that O'Flaherty, a man from Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands off the coast of Galway, should engage in rural themes, and that because of his background as an Irish language speaker from the west of Ireland, he had a unique, authentic access to the natural world, and it is this connection that makes his short fiction so powerful. Confirming this, it is often his urban works, those with a non-Irish setting, that are seen as lacking in contrast to his animal short stories, which are considered high points of his oeuvre. As Catherine O'Callaghan outlines, the west of Ireland has long been a placeholder for an essentialist notion of Irishness and promoted as a source of creative sustenance and literary engagement, with the West is laden with complex, unresolved issues concerning identity. End quote. It appears concepts of Irishness that foreground, again quoting Maureen O'Connor, close affinity with animals, has meant that O'Flaherty's other work that does not align as closely with the author's image as authentically Irish are dismissed as unworthy of consideration and or merit. It is my contention, however, that while his many animal short stories have much to offer in terms of their engagement with the non-human animal, many of his other fictional works, which have previously been assessed as playing into dehumanizing stereotypes of Irishness, are laden with human and particularly masculine animality that gives insight into the animal nature of human beings. One such text is Return of the Brute, O'Flaherty's only sustained work, which engages with his experiences of World War I. It depicts life in the trenches for a single section from the point of view of Private William Gunn, who over the course of 24 hours dissolves into madness, killing his corporal and succumbing to enemy fire. It is on the face of it a very simple anti-war novel, which focuses on the horror of trench warfare, which has been for the most part critically dismissed as unworthy of attention. An exception is Robert Starr's reading of the quote, nuanced perspectives of the working class soldier's experience in O'Flaherty's work. While Starr argues that, quote, the untamed nature in this novel is in contrast to the idealized domesticated rural landscape, end quote, of other representations of the Great War that foregrounded more pastoral representation of the Irish landscape, he worries that O'Flaherty's animalized descriptions of these soldiers that he is, quote, to some extent playing into the hands of those who house stereotypical images of the Irish, such as in Punch, even as he also speaks to the expediency of the British Army in recruiting Irish soldiers insofar as they celebrate their natural fighting spirit in order to overcome the threat from German soldiers similarly portrayed as apes. If we contrast one of his animal stories with his representation of human animal soldiers, however, I think we can find far more affinity between human and animal nature in his work than this reading suggests. Many of O'Flaherty's animal stories, such as the one I have mentioned in the last slide, end in the death or wounding of the non-human animal, and to quote Elena Cleary, stand out as profound comment on the tragic transience of life on Earth. Animals are first and foremost temporal and vulnerable living creatures, not unlike human beings, end quote. In Sandrock, or the hawk, the powerful hawk and his mate, who reign over their cliff domain, when threatened by human interference, respond in fear and aggression. The female hawk screaming and clawing at her attackers, while in a poignant attempt to save their family, causes her mate to respond, quote, drawn to battle by the wild, sad tenderness aroused in him by his mate's screech, he folded his wings and stooped, charging the attackers. O'Flaherty's human animal soldiers respond in similar ways to the naturally brutalizing experiences of war. Quote, Reel uttered a horrible moan and clawed at them. Then he began to wriggle, and a great gush of blood issued from his stomach through the field bandages they had placed on it. His face contorted, he bared his teeth, end quote. I would argue that rather than proffering an image of the Irishman as a natural fighter, as the enduring stereotype suggests, O'Flaherty's soldiers showcase a natural will to survive, much like his many descriptive stories that explore animal survival, instinct, and that the compassion and understanding presumed to permeate his animal stories are a central component of his novel, as well as other similar works. Next, I will explore a similar phenomenon in O'Flaherty's fellow Galway writer, Pádraic Conaire. Just briefly, for those of you unfamiliar with Conaire, he was an Irish language writer born in Galway City, but raised in Rzburg in Conaire, an Irish language speaking area. And together with Pádraic Pearse, that Maureen DeLeo spoke about yesterday, is one of the most influential writers of the Gaelic revival in Ireland. He wrote prolifically in his short life, but died in destitution, partly as a result of his alcoholism. Described by many critics as one of the first modernist writers in the Irish language, it may be more appropriate to describe him as a proto-modernist, as while elements of his fiction may verge on the modernist, not all of it stands up as such. However, his contributions to the Irish language literature has inspired many other Irish language modernists, including Joseph McGrana and Martin O'Kane, whose influence on Irish language literature is often compared to Joyce's influence on Irish literature in English. The natural world is a recurring motif in many of O'Conaire's literary works, and animals and human animality are central to this. Most directly tied to Conaire is the image of his little black donkey, which first appeared in On Crown Gaeilgeach in 1919, and which was translated to Field and Fair 10 years later, shortly after the author's untimely death in 1928. In the first vignette, simply titled Cuera, or Invitation, O'Conaire invites the reader to come along with me and watch the coming of spring with all its delights and glory, learn of the birds of the wood, the little animals of the gardens, the insects of the bushes, the trout in his pool, the little timid rabbit, the fleet-footed hare, the hard-fighting badger, the fox, the thorny hedgehog, the brown squirrel on the tree, and the otter in the river foam, end quote. Then in the second episode of the collection, in what is perhaps O'Conaire's most well-known work, Ma'asal Feoch Dubh, we are introduced to the anthropomorphized little black donkey, which will accompany him on his travels. While not in line with the modernist bent of some of his other works, it was a frequent text on many curriculums in Ireland, and its many translations are a testament to its enduring popularity. The tale of a donkey who is, quote, so wise he stores away a part of his food, end quote, saved the previous owner's son from drowning, and whose nervous disposition forces the narrator to make blinkers out of foliage for him, foregrounds the relationship between humans and our non-human animal counterparts. O'Conaire represents the donkey's ties to humanity as domestic in the familial sense rather than as livestock. The former owner's family wails as he is parted from them in mourning, and the narrator asserts, Tá tasal feoch dubh a gom gofol, agus beg go coil for é, or roughly translated, I still have the little black donkey, and he'll be with me until I lose him, framing the donkey's future death in euphemistic language and confirming that he does not intend to part with him. Concerning Liam O'Flaherty's animal stories, Elena Aguilera writes, quote, grounded in the poignant reminder of shared vulnerability and mortality, the interspecies affinity between humans and animals is also emphasized by the attribution to animals of capacities such as character, intelligence, and emotion, end quote. Much the same can be said of the way O'Conaire writes animals in his work. Indeed, the interspecies affinity between the donkey and humans is emphasized early in the story when the owner claims that he often had to raid the donkey's stash of food to feed his family, and if it was not for the animal's foresight, they would have gone hungry. Pádraic Moira, by comparison, is a story that foregrounds the animality of the human and the vulnerability and mortality we share with non-human animals. O'Conaire utilizes the folk belief that the Keneally family are related to seals to explore the detrimental effects of industrialization on the poor. Fádaín is disabled by a delayed explosion while working on the relief scheme in his locality and spends his compensation money on alcohol. Eventually, he cannot provide for his family anymore as his increasing sight loss prevents him from fishing, and so he enters the poorhouse. Fádaín does not do well there and gains a reputation for being mentally ill and violent, and is branded a wild beast. Near death, Fádaín imagines an alternative universe, under the sea, where he and his seal brethren can live in harmony, away from the cruel world of humanity, and his sight will be restored by, quote, a healer amongst the seals, end quote. as a reward for his enduring loyalty and kinship with them. Fáidín Moira is a precursor to Conaire's later novel Draic, or Exile, as it is titled in translation. And it is this work that forms a large part of the claim that O'Conor was an early modernist writer. It follows the almost stream of consciousness rambling of an Irish emigrant who's disabled before the novel takes place, and when he's hit by a motor car, and in much the same way as Fáidín Moira, he quickly runs out of his compensation money. The novel predominantly takes place in the urban centre of London. However, despite this, the natural world is a recurring motif. The London of Draic is teeming with non-human animals. Pulling a blade of grass up from the ground, the protagonist remarks, quote, "There's a long-legged yellow insect clinging half dead to the tip of it. When I shake the stem, the insect falls to the ground and puts up its legs to defend itself. I become aware of a great number of similar creatures, all with a half-dead appearance. They are preparing themselves for their winter's sleep. If only I could hibernate," end quote. Here, the protagonist, who's hungry and destitute, much like O'Conor himself often was, wishes he could hibernate to get through the winter. Michael, already physically different, this is the main character of the novel, is further alienated one night when, drunk in a pub, he lapses into speaking his first language, Irish. He catches the attention of an inquisitive character, O'Conor names the Little Yellow Man, and another man, a sailor, proceeds to invent a fantastical backstory for the disabled man. He says that Michael is a German lunatic who killed several people and then went to Africa, where he hunted lions and was injured when a lion caught him unaware. The sailor further embellishes the story by telling the Little Yellow Man that he put Michael on display as a wild man all over Europe, and that they had made huge money on this venture. As it happens, the Little Yellow Man is a circus ringmaster, and he is very interested in exhibiting this dangerous. Otherwise known as the Elephant Man, quote, "If Cthulhu nach raibh Pádraic O'Conor Ainalach ar sail na Tashbantas, Gal pinging and Dinna Vila Hiach Combrachnu an Weymach, and Hannah na Hena a Vila Hiach Combrachnu Joseph Werk." Or in my translation, it appears O'Conor was not ignorant of the world of sideshows. 2 pence per person was the rate to see Michael, the same rate that was paid to see Merrick. Michael's exhibition in a cage also draws to mind the display of people in so-called human zoos. Quote, "During the latter 19th and early 20th centuries, the practice of exhibiting Indigenous peoples was widespread and commonly accepted," end quote. In Europe, these Indigenous people would have been predominantly of African origin, and O'Conor demonstrates the demand for an African spectacle by directly associating Michael with lions and the African jungle. Indeed, Michael appears to be the lion man to Merrick's elephant man. In the end, Michael agrees to go on tour with the Little Yellow Man, and his descriptions of the humiliation as a sideshow act utilize many comparisons with animals. He's part of a contingent of, quote, "horrors and wonders and wild beasts," end quote. He roars like a lion, has a long wig as a mane, men feign whipping him to add to the spectacle, and he is in chains, which both chime like the little brass bells you often see hanging from beneath a horse's neck, end quote. Eventually, the circus comes to his hometown, Galway, and in the most memorable moment of the novel, Michael, who cannot take the humiliation any longer, grows angry and exclaims, "Nach fear be on, was I not a man? Had I not feeling and intelligence, understanding like every man? Are they not Christians?" End quote. A powerful episode reminiscent of Shylock's speech in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. It is also hugely evocative of another speech, however, one that Angela Burke references in her article, Legless in London, Pádraic O'Conor and Eamon le Burke. Quote, "It is unlikely O'Conor was familiar with the words supposed to have been spoken by the slave woman Sojourner Truth in Ohio and Ain't I a Woman, but those he gives Michael had the same poignancy and the same underlying meaning," end quote. Sojourner Truth, a former slave, abolitionist, civil and women's rights activist in the 19th century, is famous for this speech he made in 1851, which drew attention to the double standards of the women's rights movement, as it did not consider her oppression as a Black woman specifically. While it is now accepted that Truth probably did not actually proclaim "ain't I woman," as she was not Southern, nor was English her first language, and therefore it was unlikely she had that stereotypical Southern accent deployed in the famous iteration of her speech, the sentiments remain the same, pointing out that as a Black woman, femininity is often out of her reach, and she therefore experiences womanhood differently. While I agree with Angela Burke that it's unlikely O'Connor was aware of Sojourner Truth and this speech, the phraseology utilised in the feminist abolitionist Frances Gage's recounting of the speech is highly evocative of another slogan that Gage may have been referencing to make Truth's speech more memorable. Additionally, O'Connor is far more likely to have been familiar with this phrase. The phrase is, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which was first used in Britain in the late 18th century next to an image of a kneeling slave, imploring the viewer to reflect on his humanity and his potential status as a brother in Christ. Subsequently, it both became the catchphrase of the British and American abolition movements, and the image was widely reproduced. It is highly probable that O'Connor would have encountered the image or the phrase in some capacity due to its ubiquitous nature. Furthermore, as there is evidence in the text of draic that he's directly contrasting Michael's condition with that of the African-American slave, much like other nationalists had done before him. Describing his position in the parade, Michael says, quote, "There is a brass chain around my neck, another around my waist. My keepers, whom I am surrounded by at all time, start to lash me with their long, stiff whips," end quote. He also invokes the transatlantic slave trade when talking about one of the beasts locked up in the cage, quote, "moving to and fro in his prison, to and fro without relief, as if he were remembering all that he had left behind him in his native country," end quote. O'Connor's appeal to the subjectivity of Michael, while it replicates the humanist slogan of abolition, it does not appear to be humanist in argument. Michael doesn't distance himself from animality in order to assert his subjectivity, but rather asks the reader to consider the subjectivity of the animal and its relation to his own situation. It is not their animal nature that denies these beasts their dignity and freedom, but their capture and subjugation by cruel humans. Much like it is not Michael's disability that causes him to be objectified, but rather those around him who seek to profit from his misfortune. Both authors engage extensively with the animal world in their work, but also foreground their similarities to the non-human animal. As quoting Oscar Wilde, "There is no mode of action, no form of emotion that we do not share," and if you'll permit me to remove his hierarchical distinction with other animals, just as O'Flaherty and O'Connor's animal stories are grounded in compassion and understanding for the non-human animal, so too are their works that deal with animalized humans. Both authors were involved in various socialist and communist movements in their lifetime, and while I'm not trying to suggest they were animal activists, I feel there is a sense of equity in their acknowledgement of the differences and yet similarities between humans and non-human animals, and their portrayal of both in their work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the paper. Thank you to both of you for bringing together these, again, really important themes of gender, class, race was kind of ongoing in both your papers, and also showing how literature both participates in and disrupts these discourses. So I think really important. We do have time for questions. Any comments? Questions? Yeah. Thank you for this papers. Really interesting. I have a question for Teresa. I was really interested in this figure of the donkey.
Yes, well, perhaps it resonates with the benches of Wiener and the very complicated Jen, yeah. But that's not my question. The question is, we talked a little bit about companion species yesterday, and would you see this point his donkey as companion? It seemed a bit interesting.
Yeah, so the book that this story is in is actually kind of a longer form in which he goes on an adventure with the donkey around Ireland. And while it's unlikely this donkey actually existed, it became such a huge kind of persona within his work that people did believe it existed. And there's a famous poem where he himself is kind of seen as the donkey after his death. And I've no doubt that it actually inspired the donkey in Banshees of Inisherin, because it's become an evocative image in Galway that isn't as directly tied to a Conaire anymore, because people aren't as aware of a Conaire. But yeah, definitely a companion throughout this piece, and a companion that people associated with him forevermore afterwards, yeah.
I also had a question, Dieter. I was interested in the actual historical figures. Do we know anything about the women? I mean, we know kind of what is written about them, but do we know who they were? Where they actually came from, which part of Ireland, kind of how they traveled, to which kind of context were they actually in? Do we know anything about them?
Okay, so we have some historical evidence as far as the aristocrats are concerned. Not the lower class Wetnurse, of course, who is entirely anonymous, unnamed, silenced. She doesn't speak, although next to no women speak in sonnets. Yeah, as far as her family is concerned, so we know that her father, the Earl of Kildare, he became Irish viceroy, he was appointed viceroy, and then owing to what most sources attribute to Henry's capricious temper, he was considered a rebel, and that was yeah, basically the starting point of the Tudor conquest of Ireland. So he lost his deputyship, he was imprisoned in the Tower, and so we know something about that. We also know a little bit about Geraldine's mother in terms of marriage documents. I haven't found a picture, a painting showing her. There are paintings showing her father, but not her mother. And yeah, so basically what we also know that is that the young woman, she was born in Tuscany, but as far as this cultural transfer, Italian connection is concerned, we don't know much apart from this Gherardini speculation, which according to Giorgio Vasari, so he thinks that there is some evidence, but just look at American popular culture. You always find these search your ancestors websites, and whenever you enter Kennedy and even John F. Kennedy, they also claimed that they, yeah, their roots date back to yeah, these Florentine aristocrats. So there's a lot of popular culture myth making it work. So I absolutely agree that the exact connection would be interesting. But what I was interested in is this cultural circulating. So we all know that Italian Renaissance culture was imported by Henry's courtiers to London. But yeah, what's not so much known, for instance, is this Kenneth Branagh connection where English culture borrowed from Italian culture. It returns, so to speak, to its place of origin. And I think this sort of circulation sort of causes power. It never works in the top bottom direction. It always circulates. So yeah, I really like or was interested in this circulating movement.
Thanks for thinking of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for the wonderful talks today. We really enjoyed them. Teresa, it was wonderful to hear your insights today, and we will be able to put them every and go back to a little bit of nostalgia to my school days. You will?
Yeah.
Didn't have a chance to have spoken Irish. I was wondering if it's still possible and it's still on the curriculum.
Do specifically, I don't know, I only know anecdotally from other people within Irish language schools who've looked at it, but I couldn't tell you if it's on the curriculum or just.
And do you know largest stories in Irish?
I couldn't tell you if they're on the curriculum. I have heard anecdotally that dual was being taught in schools, but I don't know if it was under an official capacity or just kind of as a pet hobby in Irish language schools, where they've gone through the course very quickly.
Just checked how much it is online, with big dogs and profit from us data. To see if it's translated in Spanish, so that's actually of interest to do something.
Yeah. I know Micheál Conaire has actually translated some of his English works into Irish as ways for Limo Farta in that way. So yeah, if that's of interest to you. Yeah.
Could you repeat his name?
Micheál Conaire, he's translated some of Limo Farta's English works into Irish. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Further questions? Yeah, for now, it's been a long day already, and we could start 5 minutes early with our closing remarks, but not before thanking you and